Hi, Misasha. Welcome to All Over Again podcast. It's so great to see you.
Oh my gosh, it's so exciting to be here. Thank you so much.
I was so excited that you said yes to joining me. I'm a huge fan of Dear White Women. I've learned a lot personally, and I think it's a very important platform that we should all be talking about. But first, I want to talk about you and, of course, what led you to Dear White Women. What is your why?
Ooh, I love that you started with this question. My why has changed a little bit over the years, but I today sitting here, my why is really my kids, and not only my kids, but their entire generation and how we think about who those children are going to become as adults. And when I say my kids, I think a lot of parents may feel the same way, or people who are around children in any form may feel that way. And I think for me, it's personally tied to who are my children. I have two boys who are one's going into middle school, which is hard for me to believe, and then one is 9 going on 27. But they identify, which is true. Hopefully he doesn't hear this until he actually is 27. But they are Black, Japanese, and white, and their racial identity is really important to them. It's really important to me, but it also really impacts how they move through the world, how they're seen by the world, and what opportunities are available to them currently. So all of the work, you mentioned Dear White Women, that I do with that I do in a lot of my pro bono legal work, it's all related to the world that I would like them to live in, right? The world that has to be better than the world that we're living in right now. And what does their future look like?
I think that is so important. And how does the work that you do resonate with them? I mean, do you talk about it with them often? And in what context? Because they're kids. I'd love to hear that.
Well, it's funny because my older son apparently Googled my name and was like, I think you're a celebrity because your name is on the web and you wrote a book. And I was like, wow, it is a real low bar in elementary school to be a celebrity, apparently. And then my younger son was like, I don't know, you're not a YouTuber, so I'm not sure we can call her a celebrity. And then I had a whole other host of questions. But they do know what I do. And they know because, and how I think, going back to your question of how do I talk about it with them, like in a really age appropriate way, because also given who they are, I'm trying to have this conversation in a way that informs them about what their world is like and equips them to move through the world in ways that are, different than how white children will move through the world. But at the same time, I want them to really hold on to what kids do so well, right? Which is question things, and ask those questions because they have an innate sense of really what is fair and what is just. And they ask questions reflective of that. And so I want them to hold on to those questions. And the ability to ask those questions, because I think as adults, we get steered towards not asking questions, right? And just sort of going with the status quo or going with what seems comfortable. So I want them to always be asking why. So every time they ask me why, and they ask why a lot, as kids do, I really want to answer them honestly and with enough detail so they understand why I'm answering the way that I do. But I can tell that because sometimes I get asked, well, how do you know that your kids are actually absorbing this, or how does it translate into how they are? And my son last year was in 5th grade and they were studying early American history. And I realized that a lot of what I was telling him, or a lot of our discussions around the house, was kind of sinking in because he came home and he was like, well, so we were talking about the Mayflower today, and we were talking about the compact that they made on the Mayflower. But when I think about this, I think about how there were just white men who owned land on the Mayflower and how the decisions they were making were around, what would benefit white landowning men. And that was never something that I would have, my 5th grade self would have ever, recognized, said, consciously known. But it made me so proud because I think, if he's continuing to use this lens of asking why as he moves through his education and his place in the world, like that's what I want to leave them with.
And clearly, your son felt comfortable and confident enough to be able to, make these, sort of reference and parallel points. I mean, that is really mature. I listened to that and I thought, wow, there's no way as a fifth grader or even as a college kid, I think, well, maybe in college, that I would have started to really make those parallels, right? So that's incredible, and
Yeah.
that seems like he is, well ahead of his time. So, let's talk about the fact that he has you to thank for that, for always being transparent with him. And speaking of transparency, is there a really tough question that you've had to answer? And if so, what was it and how did you answer it? Around around, growing up in a world that is very sort of confusing from a diversity standpoint.
Yeah, when you ask that question, I think back to a conversation that I had with my father, who is a Japanese immigrant, and it was a conversation that my son overheard, my oldest son overheard, and this was right at sort of the start of the really violent part of this recent wave of anti-Asian hate. And
Mm,
I had called my father because I was really concerned for him because he lives in Southern California. There were a number of incidents that I was hearing about in Southern California. And my call was to ask him to please be careful when he goes to do his everyday things, like his going to the grocery store, right? I really wanted him to be careful because he goes to a Japanese supermarket. And that was a really hard conversation for me to have because having this conversation with my Japanese father is basically like we don't actually say what we want to say. We say very few words and then we understand each other and then we hang up and that's it. And my son overheard it and he saw me be fairly upset after I got off the phone. He said, "What was that call about?" And I said, "Well, I'm really, I'm worried about grandpa because there is a lot of violence directed against Asian individuals right now." And he said, "Do I need to be worried about you? Are you going to be safe?" And like that was so heartbreaking for me as a mother because I spend a lot of my energy wanting to make sure that he's safe, that his brother's safe, that my husband's safe, that my father's safe. I don't want him worried about me. And I think that in that moment, I was like, oh, this is such a heavy thing, right? It is a heaviness. Like I could feel it in my body, like just this, oh, this is not the world I want for him. This is not something he needs to be worried about. And what I said to him in the moment was, after like having nothing go through my head except this feeling was, no, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be here for all of you. But yeah, those are just those moments that stay with you. This is probably 3 years later. And as I sit here, I can feel that heaviness still. So yeah, definitely.
wow. So he was in second grade at the time. Again, these are really big 3 years ago, right? These are really big
Yeah.
thoughts and conversations to be having at such a young age, and the same way that you're looking out for your dad, your son is looking out for you. I mean, what I feel in that is so much beautiful love and compassion.
Mm,
But it's also very and it's also interesting because as a mother, you want to protect everyone from everything and you're not thinking about yourself. And it's fascinating because it's heavy and it's hard that we live in this world and those kind of realities, right? But the fact that you have a relationship with your son where you can talk about these really big topics is huge because you just shared that these are conversations you really didn't have with your dad, right? And it's a generational thing too. I'm sure at least with there certain things were not discussed with my father, and I'm first generation American too. Speaking of being first generation American, did growing up as a first generation impact you in any way?
as a bit of background, right? My dad is a Japanese immigrant from Tokyo. My mom is a white woman from Seattle. And despite her being white, and American, our household was very Japanese growing up. And so it was, and it was also, I should make this point because growing up in Los Angeles, there were a lot of Japanese Americans in Los Angeles who had relatives who had been incarcerated, right, in the Japanese American incarceration camps, right, during World War II. And that was a very different Japanese identity in certain ways than my dad's being an immigrant. And so a lot of our cultural background was very much like Japanese from Japan, for lack of a better word, like an immediate tie and link. Like we would spend a lot of time going back to Japan. The expectation was that we were going to be very focused on academic achievement. And I think that, the whole mentality of coming here and doing this thing for your family, right, and giving your family this opportunity, I feel like you may have experienced this too. There's a lot that comes down to that first generation American of, this is the path that I need to be on, this is what I need to do to accomplish that. So yeah. And also, as the Japanese, is the daughter in the family, I had a very strict curfew that was very different than what my brother experienced. So I remember thinking like this was so unfair at the time, but I understand, now, not my high school self, but, my mid-40s self, why that was important to my father, and why my rebelling against that or trying to push back against that was just so unconscionable at the time.
Yeah, I understand things a lot better now than I did when I was younger. I think there's definitely a large emphasis on education and pressure because they made our lives better. And so there's this innate, like, don't you appreciate it? You need to step up to the plate. And there are a lot of expectations. I'm not surprised that you became a lawyer, but also, like, I love that you made law into a support system for how you wanted to use your voice. That's really cool. So, speaking of, you've shared that you'd get louder for the things that matter to you and your family in ways that you never saw coming. I was curious when I was reading that. So, what didn't you see coming?
Part of this relates to the last question that we were talking about, that sort of first generation American experience. And I think growing up as a Japanese American woman, I was really expected. And not only did I feel this, but I had been actively told this at times, right? That my role is to sort of keep my head down, work hard, and largely I wasn't supposed to be sharing what I was thinking, or my voice wasn't supposed to matter in certain ways. And it sounds weird to me even saying this now, but that was definitely what got me through a lot of different sort of academic settings, and all the way to being a junior attorney, because I think my voice was valued in certain ways, but there were a lot of stereotypes around showing up as a woman named Misasha Suzuki in a law firm, and people were it was very clear that Asian females were supposed to act a certain way, and if I didn't act that way, that was not acceptable. And so, but what I didn't see coming was the trajectory that was going to take my life off of this like sort of very scripted path, right? Like I had gone to a good college, a good law school, I had gotten a job at like a very big law firm as a junior associate, and my track was going to be the partnership track and all of that. And I got married along the way, and had kids, and decided that that was not at all for me. In fact, because of my kids being who they are, right? As I shared at the start, like I was in a role to speak up for them and for other things that I had previously thought I couldn't because of who I was. But I realized that, in fact, because of who I am, right, a mother to Black boys in this country, that's why my voice needs to be so loud. And I had thought about it in law and in different ways, because the reason why I went to law school on some level was because of reading about the Supreme Court case, the Korematsu versus United States case, and the Japanese American incarceration. I thought, like, that is so horrible that this could happen and that people's voices were silenced. Like, I need to do something about that. I need to fight for the people whose voices are being silenced, and then you get into corporate law, and that fight sounds great, and you also need to keep a job. And so how to figure out how to do all of that was something I was not doing so well at. I was doing a lot of pro bono work, but I was really focusing on, intellectual property litigation. It was really sort of stepping off that path when after I had my second son, that made me sort of reframe everything and think like, oh, this this is much more how I should be using my voice. Like, this is how I can use my voice where other people's voices are silenced.
And I remember reading somewhere, and correct me if I'm off here, that the platform of Dear White Women, and in particular, your finding your voice really came from your days at Harvard. Isn't that how you met your business partner, Sarah, and friend as well?
Yeah. Yes. Best friend slash business partner, which I feel so lucky to say, because who gets to work with their best friend of like 26 years, I guess, at this point. Yeah. We met at Harvard, walking out of a discussion about race. So it's really only fitting, I think, that, 26 years later, we're still talking about race pretty much every day. If you saw our text message thread, even when we're not recording the podcast or speaking or talking about our next book, like, it's all sort of about identity and belonging and race, and sometimes kid stuff too, but we met walking in a group which was called the Half Asian People's Association. And both of us had not known very many half people who were um, both Asian and something else, even growing up in Los Angeles and Sarah growing up in New York. But the conversation started off with, in that day, in that group, with the question, are we half a person or are we double a person? And we were immediately like, I don't think that's the question. So a few of us got up and, like, we sort of met walking out together. And I think the fact that we've been challenging what questions should be asked is very telling when it comes to our friendship and what we do together now.
Speaking of which, you mentioned it somewhere that there were conversations that were missing in your social circles. Did you start to find them through your conversation with Sarah and, others that were sort of, questioning, because that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, the whole idea of being half a person or double a person, like, that's really different. In a way that, like, it just, my logical mind is like, how does that make sense? Right? Like, that's the wrong question. Like, and right? So to your point, so what were the conversations that were not happening in your social circles that you identified as missing that needed to be asked?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I should say that Sarah lives in Denver currently, and I live in the Bay Area, and we live in sort of predominantly white suburban neighborhoods. And when I was talking about what's not being discussed or what's not being asked in those social circles, Sarah and I are both biracial, right? She has a Japanese immigrant mother and a white father. I have the reverse. And by virtue of being biracial, I think we've been able to sort of float in social circles full of white women for years, right? It's not just a recent thing. So when you float through those social circles, you realize what's being said or what's being asked, what's not being asked or said, and what's being said or asked or not asked when people believe that there's no woman of color in that space. And I think that third part, that was one of the reasons why we created Dear White Women to begin with, because I think especially after having children, you reflect on things very differently. And in those social circles, right, especially social circles full of mothers, you have conversations about your kids a lot. A lot of those conversations centered around, kids' happiness and all of the gear that you need for your kids, of which there is a never-ending list, and your hopes, right, for your kids, and sometimes your fears. But, one of my biggest fears for my boys is that they will walk out of our house one day and not come back, right? Solely because of the color of their skin. And that fear was definitely not being discussed. And I understand why not, because part of that is lived experience, right? If that is not your lived experience, and that is not a fear for your child, I get that that's not something you're going to share personally. But at the same time, there seemed to be an aversion to even having conversations like this because they were uncomfortable, or that it was too political, or a whole host of other reasons. But really, this was my family's reality. And so Sarah and I thought, like, well, what if we could change the conversations in those circles? What if we can make those conversations more inclusive of the community as a whole? Right. And what if we then are shaping those conversations to make those generations, tying this all the way back to the start of this episode, those future generations coming, like, what if we could make it so that their future social circles will include those conversations by default? And so that was the whole premise, or one of the large premises on which we built Dear White Women, to see if we could do that. But yeah, it really stemmed from our own personal experiences of like, that's really interesting that that's being said, or that's not being said, and what if we could do something about that?
What is one of the most sort of common questions that needs to be asked that is not being asked even today?
Mm.
That's a loaded question.
It's a good one. I mean, I think, okay, so um, I mean, I love the question why, right? I think we all need to be asking why a little bit more. Like, for example, why are we not talking about Black people at my child's school outside of Black History Month? And look, like, I'm the first person to tell you that, like, parenting and life, like, it gets very busy, right? And there are a lot of things that you feel like I'm just too tired or overwhelmed to address. But I think that, especially when it comes to that next generation, we've got to be asking the whys, right? We can ask that in our workplace, right? Like, why does the hiring committee only have, one person of color and one woman on it, right? Why, I think that once we start asking that question, and depending on the answer you get, right, which my least favorite answer is because it's always been that way, right? And when you get that answer, you're like, well, now I'm going to have to ask 50 more questions. But I think that people think that in order to change things, there has to be this huge, got to be at the front of a march, or you've got to be, devoting your entire life to this quest, right? And I think it can be as simple as asking questions. And I think that also, along with that, like, something that I've heard when I talk to parent groups is I've heard white parents say, well, I don't want to talk to my kids about race and racism because I'm afraid it will traumatize them. When I hear that, I think it's more about how the parents feel, right? Because, growing up, like, I get it. I didn't learn a lot about a lot of things in school. And to this day, we're fighting about curriculums, and we're fighting about what's going to be included. And depending on your state, you're going to learn very different stories of the United States and the people who live in it. And I think that it's fear from parents. They don't know the answer, that they don't want to have this conversation. But I guarantee you, your kids are able to have this conversation. If I'm able to have these conversations with my kids at 7, and I'm very clear with my kids that it sucks, but they are going to be treated differently than their white friends in certain ways. So they have to understand how that's going to function, because now they're kind of old enough to ride their bikes by themselves. And, I can't always be there. But if I'm hearing white parents say I can't have these conversations with my own kids, then if my kids need help, right, because of the fact that they are Black in a predominantly white community, I need your kids to be there to
Ally.
help them in certain
Yeah,
ways, right? It's part of a community. Yeah, it's part,
absolutely.
and this is such an important part of parenting, right? To share this knowledge that we have as parents, and I get we're not going to know all the answers, but that's, to me, not a reason to not start to have the conversation.
I feel like that's what our parents did. They wanted to protect us by not having a lot of the different conversations. And I think about that in so many facets of life, right? I think about it from,
Mhm.
let's talk about it, like, female reproduction in general, right? Like there's a lot of conversations,
Oh,
right?
100%.
Grief, loss. Everybody goes on and on like they think they're never going to die. Like as long as we don't talk about it, we're not going to die. And like newsflash, I hate to say this, but we're all going to die one day. And it's kind of
Yeah.
just it's something these are the conversations we have to have from an emotional standpoint, a mental health standpoint, and I think in order to live our lives wholly, we have to be talking about all of the things and yes, you know, we are different, we are the same, right? These are like I love by the way, I love that book, that Sesame Street book. I have a little person and you know, we read the books. And books are a great place to start the education, but we have to be talking about the things because when we live in fear of the things and don't talk about them, when you're in them or facing them, whatever they may be, and in particular when you're talking about race, right? Like it's out there, right? It's not something that you can't see. So you have to talk about it because if you don't talk about it, you're burdening others with a shame that they don't deserve, right? Like what is that? Like all this secrecy stuff is just weighted shame. So I'm glad we're talking about all the things and
Yes.
you know, that's why I want to know what questions we should be asking to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I love how you say that because it's important. And we talk about not wanting to raise our kids to be quite frankly fucked up, right? Like we all have a little bit of stuff that happened and trauma and all the things.
Mhm.
Well, if we really want to do that, yes, it starts with ourselves and that starts with having open conversations. And that's why I was so curious to know like how candid you are, you know, with the conversation that you have with your children. It's crazy that we have to have the conversations that we do in general about life and that part about
Yeah.
race is very much a part of your everyday life. It's great that you're having the conversation. And we all need to be having the conversation. Was there any way that you were conditioned in your youth that you've had to relearn as an adult?
Perfectionism was a big thing, right? That I think I was really conditioned to that there is a right way and a wrong way of doing things, and that the goal is perfection, right? Like I always wanted to bring home the best test score, right? I wanted to get into the best college, or you know, I wanted to do really well there, and my whole sort of early like that period of my time was predicated even in ballet, right? I wanted to be the best ballerina. Like it's just I wasn't doing something at certain points for the love of it, right? Or because it was fulfilling. Like I wanted to excel. And I think that as an adult, and it's been a difficult journey, but it is such a necessary one. Like I have really had to divest from that goal, right? Being perfect all the time. Because being perfect, quite honestly, keeps you quiet a lot of times, right? Because you're afraid of saying the wrong thing. You're afraid of doing the wrong thing. And I feel like you live in this like tighter fashion, for lack of a better word. There is a lack of freedom there. And I think that that is the thing I did not want to pass on to my kids. Well, there's a lot of things, but that is one thing, right? I don't want them to live in this tight fashion, right? Because I think it keeps you focused on results and not the journey. And I think so much of life and, you know, is the journey, right? Like this whole everything that I am doing and that Sarah's doing in this field of anti-racism work, it is a journey, right? Because we're not perfect in this. We are going to make mistakes. And I think as a parent or, you know, someone who has kids in your life, you recognize this like every day you kind of screw up around your kids. And then the best part is though that you've got the next day to kind of address that screw up. I'm not perfect and not being not perfect either. You know, but that is something that I feel like has kept too many of us quiet for too long. And I think once I realized that the result isn't the end game, that made me a lot more free to say and do a lot of things that I actually wanted to do and wanted to say and wanted people to hear rather than, you know, stay silent for fear that I was going to say the wrong thing and someone was going to say, "Oh, I can't believe you said that."
I just had this aha moment because as another type A perfectionist over here. By the way, there's a really good book. I don't know if you've read it yet. It's called The Perfectionist's Guide to Losing Control. It's really fun. I'll send you the
Oh,
link. Yes,
no.
it
I'm going
is
to add it to my list.
so
Yay.
good. There are 7 types of us. So it's really kind of fun. Anyway, that aside, I had this aha moment as you were speaking about being perfect because I really see a linkage to people pleasing, right? Like I
Mm,
wanted to make sure everyone around me was happy because then I would be safe, right? Like they would like me.
yeah.
And then you have to say, yeah, but there's a it's harder. One, it's not your authentic voice, right? I mean, I still think there are tendencies that we still do, but if we're trying to make everyone else happy all of the times by saying the perfect things all of the time, then it depresses our voice. It depresses our voice by not sharing and talking about sometimes what is, you know, is it the pink elephant in the room? I don't even know. I have to know, right? You're very focused on, you and Sarah are both very focused on anti-racism, and I'd love to know the moment where you both decided that, okay, I'm going to pursue this Dear White Women platform. And in your case, you pivoted from a career in IP law. I mean, a little more of a traditional career. So what was the moment? I know you had been friends and you met at Harvard and you had this great connection and you were talking about it, but when was the moment where you're like, I'm going to do this full out?
Yeah. So that moment took a while. I will say that the moment that we decided because in our platform the podcast was the first thing, and the book, the speaking engagements, those sort of layered on later. But it was there were a couple things that really pushed us. I think one was the 2016 elections, and as a lawyer I really look at rights, and I would like to ensure that we have more rights than like I would like to wake up with not less rights
Yes,
tomorrow than I have today, right? Which
absolutely.
seems pretty basic, right? The actuality of it is, since that point, we have been waking up, especially as women in this country, or people of color. You've been waking up with less rights and less opportunities than we had, even as teenagers, right? And looking at that landscape, Sarah and I think, saw together that like this is not what we want for our children. And our children were really young at the time, but it was one of those moments where it was like, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? Because I think there's one thing to have this realization, and there's the next thing, which is like, okay, well, what am I personally going to do about it? And so we thought like, well, we're best friends, so we know we like to talk to each other. And we're like, we'll just try this podcasting thing. So like based on zero actual research, we were like, you know what, let's just do this. And because we thought like we have a lot of insight into those circles of white women. And I have a white mom, and we thought like, we're just going to start to have these conversations. We're going to bring on guests that we know. We're going to bring on people we'd like to talk to, and expand the narratives that people are aware of. Tell stories, right? Basically tell stories. We're going to throw in a little bit of history and law and psychology and belonging and wellness, but we're going to tell this broader story of our communities and see if that changes things. And so it was really an experiment. And then, the experiment kind of took off, and we wrote a book. And we wrote that book between the 2020 election and the January 6th insurrection. So like literally nothing was going on at that time. And we weren't homeschooling kids either during COVID. At that point, I was like, you know what? I think that in order to do this in the way that I at least would like to do this, like I need to give up what I was, a special counsel for a firm at that time, working part-time. And I was like, I can't even do that in order to do this at the level that I would like to do this. So now my I do pro bono work around election protection and voting rights, which is sort of the best of both worlds. I get to have this amazing platform with my best friend, and I still get to use my law degree, which my mom is very thankful that I'm still doing, to really work on sort of impact litigation, and that is going to shape those rights that our next generation has, right? So it was a whole bunch of things, and to be honest, a lot of ignorance around like what is podcasting anyway, that led us to this point.
Was there a moment when you were like, yes, this moment, this conversation, this something validates every reason why we started the Dear White Women platform?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't think there's one moment, right? But we get feedback from people, and I think about this one. We released this episode about the biracial experience in America, and that was a very personal experience to us because it was really about being biracial in America, what that's like, what that's not like, what people assume that is incorrect, and really telling a story that we told it for our kids because they are biracial or multiracial as well, but we were telling it for everyone else who looked like us, who identified like us, who has largely not had their story told. And we got some amazing feedback from that. But I remember one email that we got, and we read all of our emails because we have editors for the podcast, so we have no staff otherwise. So it's just us. So if you email us, we actually are reading it ourselves, and we talk about every email we receive. But this woman wrote, and she said, I listened to your podcast. I cried through the whole thing. And then I forwarded it to everyone I know because it is the first time I have really seen myself represented. And it's moments like that, where I feel like, okay, the fact that we are doing this matters. Like the people who, because I grew up not knowing that there was a whole sort of huge section of biracial people out there, and to have someone feel affirmed in that way, is so important, I think, because it is fundamentally, our platform is about humanity, right? It is about seeing all of humanity, and the fact that we made that person feel seen, totally worth it.
1,000%. The fact that you're helping people feel seen, like that statement, that has to feel so good and probably keeps you going, right?
Yeah, I think that, and the time my older son hid in the garage and read the first 3 chapters of our book, and this was maybe last year, and he's like a big reader anyway. So he was like, I really think your book is an important book. And that also was one of those moments where, not that, as I mentioned at the start, I'm doing this for them, but to have them say, like, I think what you're doing is important, as it is one of those like life affirming moments where you're like, it's all worth it now. It's all worth it.
I
But
mean,
yeah,
yeah,
that was
that
powerful.
is the most powerful of powerful, is having your child validate that something that you did was
Hmm.
necessary, or honestly was cool. I mean, wow, like that's like you hit the
Yeah.
jackpot there. There's all these new evolutionary technologies that are available to our children, but it's become so divisive and ideological at times too, depending on who is truly guiding and directing the schools. And with that said, are you concerned about the unjust imposed ideologies that have come to a boiling point at many of the universities?
So I think, like, whenever I think about this concept of like what is going on right now in our universities and in schools in general, I would say, like, I come back to the fundamental question of like, what is the role of university, right? Like, what is the role of school? And I think that, and one of the greatest things that I think back to about my own university experience, or even my law school experience, right, was that that was a place that was constructed for me to be able to debate topics, right? To debate topics, to have many different perspectives there, right? Because the whole goal along the lines of like furthering critical thinking, right, was that you were able to have these spaces to debate, because there are going to be a whole lot of people out there who do not think like you do, right? And the whole concept is, how do you exist in a world where people don't always think like you? And how do you not only learn from others, but you teach others while having these forms of debate and discussion? Obviously, with there being some like guardrails, right? Like there, when it comes to clear hate speech, that is off limits. But I think that we have politicized a lot of places. And I like really struggle with that, because I think that a lot of times now we use the words "that's political" to indicate that we don't want to talk about something, whereas it's really hard for me to draw the line, like what is the difference between political and personal right now, right? Because you could call really anything political and sort of push it to the side. But I think that we have, like, if you think about schools, right, to take it like down a little bit from higher ed to like schools where our kids are now. When I think about, and I was just listening to a podcast about this as well, when I think about schools growing up, like, and I think about my parents' involvement in schools, right? It was like along the lines of bake sales, or, working together with a whole bunch of other parents, right? Who cares what their political ideologies were, right? They were concentrated on making the school and the community like a place for children. And I think now we have politicized that to such a great extent, right? With what is happening with school boards, with what is happening with higher educations, that we have removed that community and that ability for children and young adults to have these spaces to debate, to learn, to grow, without it being attached to some political agenda that the parents have, right? Or that others have with regard to those spaces. And I think that that is a huge disservice, right? That we are doing this next generation. Because then how do you learn? How do you learn in spaces that are so incredibly politicized that you're afraid to say something? How do you learn in spaces where you're told explicitly your voice doesn't matter? And how do you learn where those boundaries are? I think that this is like, children learn, we know this, right, by doing. And again, like, I'm not advocating for just to be like a free reign, anything goes. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that we have to really look at the purpose. What is the purpose of higher education, right? What is the purpose of creating these spaces? And then are we being true to that purpose, right? When we start to limit what happens in certain ways.
So how do you learn in a space where you can't be you and you can't feel safe to live? Like, that's what's so concerning to me, that people are hiding in their dorm rooms, that people are getting death threats simply based on what they believe. And that to me is so just heartbreaking that any person would have to live through that, and particularly a child. I mean, these are children. They don't have the ability to reason fully, right? They don't have a fully functioning frontal lobe, that they don't have these, they just don't have the cognitive ability to reason, and yet they're scared. And I think about what happens to all of us when we go into fight or flight mode, and to have to live in an environment and learn in an environment where you're scared for your life based on your religion. That's just so hard for me to understand. And I guess that's the part where I don't understand why, to your point, it shouldn't be politicized, but why aren't universities stepping in for the person, regardless of the religion, regardless of, of the thing, right? And I guess I can't even say regardless, because what's happening, it particularly to so many different students, right? Jewish students in particular. It's just, I don't know. I just feel so just disheartened and sad that we have to live in a time. And I'm just grateful my kids aren't in school. I'm grateful my kid is not at a university right now in the middle of this madness, because even if you're not Jewish or you're not Muslim, how can you actually learn in an environment that's so inflammatory, like the ones that are happening. Remember how fun it was pre-social media and we didn't have to deal with this
Yeah.
bullshit?
And this is the culture that has been cultivated, right? Like we have the episode that Sarah and I recorded yesterday on our podcast was really about what a Trump presidency would mean for 2024 presidency would mean. And I think like in researching that, I went and looked at all of the hate speech that and the rhetoric that has just since 2015, right? Since the start of that his run, that has just sort of created this arc. And you can directly see hate spikes in counties where there have been speeches, where there have been language around, in particular, immigration, for example. But like, let's not forget Charlottesville. And I think that this is the space that we are in, and that is terrible and terrifying, right? That we have in that, and I'm saying we as sort of a country, and like what is our trajectory been, right? Have been okay enough with this to like sow this divisiveness that we can't repair certain things and provide these safe spaces for children, for young adults, because we are so concerned about how that looks optically, and how are we up for reelection, or what is the political agenda. And I think that is a huge shame, right? Like I think that we can't even guarantee safety. And I say this as like the mother of Black sons, right? Where I am always concerned and increasingly more concerned about their physical safety moving through the world, right? Like we can't guarantee that for our children. How terrible is that? And I wish I had a better answer. And I wish that we were not concerned about how donors and how funders and we weren't so concerned about where the money was moving and how we needed to hold on to more of that money to guard how our speech happens or doesn't happen.
And then what do we do in the situation where we're in? Maybe we're just fucked because, right, you've got this, super right-wing Republican, and you've got this, I don't even know, Biden is asleep at the wheel. The Democrats are crazy. I mean, they've become so left. It's like, where is that sweet spot in the middle where we can support women's reproductive rights and the rights for safety of all, and at the same time also ensure safety and security? Because I feel like both sides are not working. So like, how are we even up at this juncture where we're going to have a round two of it? Like, I don't understand. I feel like we are fucked. I hate to say that, but like, I don't know what the middle ground is. Like, I feel like there's got to be like, where is that person, that candidate that sits like right in the middle? Can there be a brand new Republicans, like Democrat Republicans, and they sit in the middle and then like, I don't know where this perfect party is, but I just feel like it's such a scary landscape. What happened then during Trump's reign was scary. And he as a person, he is who he is. Biden as a person, he is who he is. Neither of them seem to be the answer. What is the answer? I'm not expecting for us to come up with that, but I am genuinely scared because what's happening right now at this moment is not sustainable, and we're just at this breaking point, and I just am scared. Like, what's going to happen, Misasha? This was not even a question that I had for you, but like, if you were a betting woman, what would you tell us?
Okay, great question. Because I've gone down this spiral many times. I will say many, many times. I think on some level, I take like some level of comfort from history, right? Because I think that, and not to take this too far off course, but like after the Civil War, right, we had some presidents who actually in the period of Reconstruction, actually pardoned a whole bunch of Civil War Confederate soldiers and were like, hey, Not only am I going to pardon all of them, but I'm just going to like sort of redo this. So we're actually going to have the black codes and like all of that. So there were very fine people on both sides, and we're just going to recognize that. And then the country still reset itself at a level to like fix all of that shit that just happened, right? Post Civil War, when they were like, you know what, you guys lost, but we're still going to give you all this stuff anyway because, hey. And so I have faith. Like I read Heather Cox Richardson's letters from an American every day. Like I don't read a lot of newsletters, but I read that one because history on some level makes me feel better, because it indicates that despite all of the shit that goes down, despite terrible people doing terrible things, despite ineffective leadership, there is still a drive, an innate drive in people, in a lot of people, not all people, to make things better. And how we make things better, I'm not 100% sure. And we are tied currently, right, to one of two candidates. Then I look back to community, right? I look back to what can you do? What can you do, right? Like what can we do as a community? Because I think for a long time, the people like the far right or people with very extreme views are the loudest. And in order to rebalance things or sort of drown them out, I think that we have to get equally loud too. And how that happens, I don't 100% know. And if I did know, that would be great, because I'd be running this whole organization based on how to do exactly that. And the fact that when we get enough people to be like, you know what, this isn't working, we have to do something different, that's when change comes. But it is kind of a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back thing, which is which in our, Amazon Prime instant gratification age doesn't work for a lot of people, but it's got to. It's got to.
And when you say we've got to get loud, are you talking about the people in the middle? Because I feel like both sides are nuts. Like I mean it's crazy.
I think it's got to be the people who like things like freedom, right? Like the people, I was having this conversation about like how we don't even really know what freedom is because we never really conceptualized it. And I think on the flip side, we don't really know fully in the US what authoritarianism looks like, because that has never been a question that we've had to answer for ourselves, right? In the generations that are alive right now. And so I think that if we like things like deciding what is right for our own bodies, right? If we like things like having safety for children, if we like things like being able to have a voice in our government, even if you feel like it might not matter at times, it really does matter, especially on down ballot races. Like if we like those things, then we have to get loud about the things that we like. And there are a lot of people out there doing really great work. I'm not saying you need to create your own organization or, suddenly feel like you need to quit your job and do everything to do this, because I think it's a matter of finding the people and channeling the effort towards those people, but also talking about it more, right? Like I think like a lot of people think like, well, some of this is so outside the bounds of what I'm used to. Like this seems like we're in an alternate universe. So I can't even conceptualize this. So I'm not even going to talk about it, because things will have to work itself out. I believe that in the end, the long game is things will work themselves out. I don't think that it's going to happen without intervention, though. So I think that it's really important to pay attention to what's going on, and it may not be everything that you're really motivated and passionate about, but the things that you are really motivated and passionate about, that's like, this is the time to get involved. Because I think regardless of what happens in November, we are going to see a country that we have not known before. And so I think that given that, we've got a limited amount of time to really start to think about, well, what do I need? What do we need collectively, right? Even more than the I, what do we need to not only survive, right? Because I'm sure on some level we can survive for a while, but to thrive, right? For all of us.
Kids, like, how do we get back to kindness?
Yeah, I think, and like the thing that scares me is that our kids, depending on where you live in this country right now, and you are having a very different experience of our country if you're a child, because you're either in a place where your books are being banned, you have a very narrow view, or you can be in a place where you have a much more expansive view. And if you think about like our childhood, even though there was a lot of stuff we weren't taught, I wouldn't say it was a completely divided experience, right? I would say that there is a lot of commonality regardless of what state you grew up in. Sure, there's probably a lot of stuff you had to unlearn and relearn along the way. But I would say now, like, we have children who could be living in vastly different versions of America. And that part is terrifying, because how do you get past that, right? How do you get a generation that's so deeply divided to come back together again without some intervention now, right? And that scares me. And that's why I think, like, my demons growing up, or my villain was never like the librarian, right? Like, who are our real villains, right? Like, it wasn't my school librarian. And so I think, like, we have to protect that everything, right? To your point, for the next generation, right? Like, what does their future look like? Forget our future for a second. Like, what does their future look like? And that's the thing. Like, we have to continue to center, I think, as we think about how we fight.
And the future feels very bleak for the college kids that are at universities right now. Right. I mean, seriously, like, again, there's an extreme happening, which is crazy. A lot of them will be unemployed because companies don't want to hire this volatile group of people, particularly if they have social feeds that are volatile. They're banned, and they're probably going to be blacklisted for a very long time. And I mean, again, like, it's just, you're hearing about it already at companies. Companies are checking social feeds to see where people are in terms of their political views, right? Because it's become so bottled with the university experience. And but it's one thing to have a view. It's another thing, I think, to have a hateful view. And that part is so, that's the part that is so scary to me, that it's been so permissible to have a hateful view and voice it. Nothing happens. Like, that's the part to me that is so crazy. Like, I don't understand. What is your view on what's happening right now at universities, particularly at Harvard, your alma mater? Like, when you see what's happening in the news and like the crazy stuff, like, what goes through your head?
I did admissions for Harvard for the first time this year in like a long time as an alumni interviewer, partly because I wanted to see what was going on, and partly because the Students for Affirmative Action decision, like, I am deeply concerned about how that affects higher education. And so I wanted to kind of get involved in and see for myself what it looks like for Harvard's entering class. Like, what are we looking at? How do we consider admissions now? Because I know it's drastically different from when I was applying. I also probably could not get in now based on the the candidate pool that I saw, quite literally. It gave me a little bit of hope in that I think that, at least from a student level perspective, right, they are still looking for students who represent sort of a lot of hope for us. I think that the trickier part is, how do you continue to hold on to that in a space that's continually being challenged? I will say I get a lot of communications from Harvard about what is going on and the various committees that they have formed to look into various things. And I feel like they are being fairly proactive. They also probably have a lot of different people that they are answering to, a lot of voices, some probably louder than others, about what they need to be concerned about. And Harvard, admittedly, has a very long history with not treating certain groups of people accurately and correctly. And I think it's only recently sort of owning up to its role in a lot of different things, including a lot of questions around slavery. It is a really tricky question. And I want the Harvard that I knew, which was the Harvard where I felt as a 18-year-old coming from Los Angeles, that my world completely changed in the best way possible when I started at the school, because not only did I meet people who thought completely differently from me, I met people from pretty much every country I could have imagined. I met people who grew up very differently than me also. And I felt like they met me also very different, very different conceptually from who they imagined was coming from Los Angeles, right, at the time. And I think that the most important thing about that was we were able to have all these conversations and really challenge each other's viewpoints and thoughts, and in small group seminars and in, larger groups. And it was always super respectful. And that part is like the part that I have the hardest time with, right? Because to your point, Natalie, it's like we have been okay with allowing not only disrespect, right, but pure hate to be acceptable. I'm just never going to be okay with that, because I think that we have like looked the other way, or we have cultivated that under the guise of the ability to feel free to say what you want to say. And I think there are limits to that. There are clear limits to that exist in free speech as well, right? And I think it goes back to, what do we want our colleges and universities to be? How do we want this next generation to be raised in those spaces? Like, how do we keep them feeling safe in those spaces? Like, which includes like some clear guidelines around what we're going to be okay with in terms of speech and what we're not going to be okay with. And also, I think to where students are protesting, right, which is like a hallmark of universities, right, and colleges. And I think that is you finding your voice as a student too, like to be very receptive to those as well. Like, not all protests are equal, to be clear. Not all speech is equal. And I think that the more clear we can be on those policies, the better. But also, like, going back to what do we want the role of higher education to be? And how do we want this next generation to come out of their 4-year experience, right? Like, or I think that we have to think longer than incident by incident. We have to think about the end game, the long game, right? What is that goal? And we lose sight of it for a whole host of reasons, like we've discussed along the way, money being a big one, and political views, and whose views speak the loudest, or who is the loudest. But we've got to keep coming back to that.
When I hear you say who speaks the loudest, what really concerns me, it is who has the most money to fund social media and digital advertising. That's what plays in my head. Like, he or she that has the most money can control actual groups through advertising digitally, but also through influencer marketing, and very much in the same way that special interest groups seem to and have controlled our government and the messaging that is put out for years and years. It's just an interesting new evolution of it all. And I think that to me, perhaps there's some sort of something that needs to be put in place on a larger level, because I'm all about free speech so long as it's respectful and doesn't encourage actual hurt, not just by words, but by action. It's the action right now, and that misinformation, and that to me is like, that is worrisome. When you think about our children's generation, who, by the way, I do not think are fucked, because I think we have time to correct it, what concerns you about our children's generation?
Yeah, I think it comes back to when I was talking about, how children, depending on where you live, right, you're growing up with a very different, very divided view of what our country is. Not only like what our country is, what our history was,
like who our country is for, a lot of that, right? And I think that without those critical thinking skills that we were talking about at the start, right? Without deductive reasoning, without the ability to say, like, hang on, that doesn't seem right to me because that goes against like what we just read, or what I've heard, without the ability to question that, we have we have a large problem, right? Because we're going to have a group of children who cannot speak to each other, who cannot actually have conversations, because it's like you are coming from two separate realities. And I think that when we were growing up, right, and I keep referencing this because I keep thinking about the difference, right? Like we had teachers, right, whose job it was to teach at school, and librarians, right, who do a lot of work in curating the books. And I think that those are professions, right, which are really important and really hard. As the daughter of a teacher, I can say that from firsthand knowledge. But I feel like now we have been okay with letting parents come in and be like, you know what? I know they have all these degrees, but I also know what's going to work. And like, I'm just going to tell you all that this is what's going to be happening for my child. And I think that is where we have to like let teachers teach and librarians do their job, and so that we can have this ability for children, regardless of where they're growing up, to be able to be this next generation without being so split, without being so divided, without like possessing the skills to question, and to ask questions and to listen to others, because we're already at somewhat of a disadvantage here because we had COVID right in the middle of a lot of our kids growing up. So, I see the difference with my 11-year-old and my 9-year-old, right, in terms of just social skills and relating, because one was in second grade when everything shut down and one was in kindergarten. And that is a huge difference, in just 2 years. And so I think we're already dealing with children and young adults, right, who had their childhood disrupted in very like ways that we probably don't even understand right now. But on top of that, we are telling them like these things, and I think it's like let out of fear, right? These things are going to hurt you, so we're not going to talk about these things. These books are scary, so we're not going to read these things. And it sort of chills the curiosity, the natural curiosity of childhood. And I think that is really like, if we really want to be thinking about that next generation, we need to cultivate that curiosity, because that curiosity leads to inventions. That curiosity leads to making things better. That curiosity leads to building bridges. And I think that right now we are actively like destroying it. And that's the thing that really concerns me. Like, and that, to your point, like we have time to fix this, right? We have time to make this better. We have time to really deeply think about like, what do we want our schools to look like? What do we want our community spaces for children to look like? Like, how do we want to encourage children's voices and encourage that curiosity and that resilience and all of that like, has been sort of stripped from schools at times and stripped from them through COVID and all of the resulting, and all of our issues as parents, right, coming out of that. And to really cultivate like what it is we held dear from our childhood and what we can set them up for that was even better than what we had.
Save our kids. Yes, I think that I love everything you said, and I think that we somehow need to reevaluate the pieces in place where we let go. Right? I'm a daughter of a teacher too, so I hear you. And your mom was a teacher. My mom was a teacher. I think that era, there were really great teachers. I think something, though, along the way has happened where people are using teaching as a part of storytelling. And I'm not saying storytelling is bad. We're sitting here, we're doing storytelling right now, we're talking. But I think there is a point in which opinion and fact become modeled right now. And that, although interesting and inspiring for curiosity, also needs to be labeled as such, opinion and fact. And I think when you have these impressionable minds, you have to be able to differentiate the both, because we're doing a greater disservice by teaching our kids opinion versus fact, right? Because I don't know about you. My daughter has an amazing teacher, by the way. But when she comes home from school, she'll tell me everything she learned. It's fact. And luckily her teacher is teaching facts, right? Like we're talking about insects. We're talking about animals. We're talking about like the metamorphoses of butterflies and metamorphoses of butterflies and such. It's not politically charged, but when you add in the political elements of things, it's ideologically sort of, it's just, it blows my mind because this is not shit that we had to deal with when we were growing up. Like, I remember there were political things happening, but we were so sheltered from it. Like, unless our parents were talking about it, I don't remember school being a place where we were talking about the stuff, right? Like, I think we were in a Cold War during that time. Sorry if I'm like, yes. Like, we didn't talk about that at school.
No,
right?
we were.
We talked about that later on, and we talked about the outcomes and what have you when we were in college, but we didn't talk about it in school, I think, to the extent, and I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about it in school, but if we're going to talk about the things that are happening globally at school, I think we have to be very factual as we can be, so that we are not misrepresenting groups of people. Like it hurts my heart. And again, cities, I think, are having a very different experience than different areas of the world, or I should say the country right now, right? In San Francisco, LA, Chicago, New York City, they're having very different experiences than other places in the country at the moment. But I think when you're close to a city or in it right now, it feels supercharged, and the kids are being exposed to stuff that is mind blowing. So I feel like at this point, like, a teacher should be able to teach and be given a certain amount of free reign, of course. But I think when they impress their own opinions, it becomes very scary. Like, I don't want someone to teach their ideology to my child and my child come home and tell me it's fact, right? When I know it's not, right? Like, I don't know what's going on in San Francisco. In New York City, there has been plenty of schools where there are people that are literally recreating the map of the world. And that to me is cuckoo. Like, okay, like how can you do that? Like, you may wish that, but you're not allowed to impress your opinion, which is not fact, on a child and make them believe that, and then inspire these other feelings of ideological hate, right? I guess what I'm saying is I want our generation to be full of the kindness and the stuff that we've been talking about for years, like how to teach your kids kindness. What happened?
Yeah. Well, and I think about like who gets to who is the arbiter sometimes of opinion versus fact. And like, I think that, when you have school boards, I also just listened to a Moms of Liberty podcast related thing. So that got me all amped up about who controls what messaging in schools. And like, when you have school boards and state curriculums that have very different viewpoints on what is opinion versus what is fact, like, that part scares me too, because I think that I love truth and I love facts. And I think that there is a large disagreement in what is opinion versus fact. And I think that goes back to like critical thinking and what do we accept to be true and facts. I think that when you have a politicized school board, right, or a politicized, curriculum, state curriculum, right, then, you get huge disparities in how you talk about things. And to your point, like, I think it's really important to teach kids facts. And I'm very concerned about the arbiter of those things. And like, my kids are not in public school, they're in independent school. So I have like a larger insight into what is taught and how it's taught. And part of that is also because I have Black sons. And I grew up like learning that one of the causes of the Civil War was states' rights. And that actually wasn't really a cause of the Civil War at all. Like, it was slavery, but we didn't really talk about that in the same way then. And so I'm hopeful that schools teach facts and that schools also teach kids like deductive reasoning and critical thinking skills so that they too can, even if they are being told something, can think. And it comes with age, right? Like there are age appropriate ways to teach this. And I don't advocate for doing this all the same at certain ages, because when I go in and talk to kids about Black History Month, for example, I talk about it differently at kindergarten than I do in 5th grade. And so I think it's important to be mindful of that, but to give those kids the building blocks, right? So in 6th grade, for example, they're able to discern that like, hey, this might not be the full and complete story, like, and also give them the tools so that they can go ask the right questions or ask questions and feel empowered to ask questions too, and not just accept what is told to them. Because I think that is a very tricky thing as a child, right? When you are told something by someone you trust and you're like, yeah, that checks out, like, I'm good. Many years later, you realize, because I think we've all probably experienced that. Many years later, you're like, wait, that wasn't true at all. Wow. And so I think to just give them the tools to be able to do that for themselves is also a really important part of that. Because I wish we could guarantee that it's facts and only facts. But short of that, like, the ability to do this for themselves is key.
Your point is very well taken, that fact can be skewed depending on who is promoting and supporting the curriculum, isn't it? So that's, as far as history is concerned, there should be a way, right? If anything we have learned, that we need to all get on the same page in terms of what is historical fact and what is not. It's historical fact that the Civil War happened. I mean, and it was to abolish slavery in the end, right? Like that's what I believe it was. Yes, states' rights came into play. I get all of these things, but like, I'm still like, wait, we had 2 different experiences. Sorry, I just got really stuck on that.
No, and I mean, I think, like, since you went to school in California, like, if you think about how you were taught about the missions, right? Because I have a 4th grader who's doing his mission project right now. And I was not taught, like, I think the way that we were taught about it, because I will say, like, the Civil War, slavery was one concept that we were taught about. Like, it was over slavery, but it was also over states' rights. And I don't think those are equal things, right? And like the missions, I was taught that it was like sort of the Spanish coming in, and, you know, like the Native Americans were like real happy to see them, kind of thing. Like I was not taught sort of the colonization that happened, and like, hey, we actually displaced a whole group of people. And now my son is being taught about that. And like that part I really appreciate, because it changes your worldview, right? When you think about, like, but that is, you know, a 35, you know, year gap in that teaching, and the facts that I believe to be facts were not actually facts. So yeah, like, and I mean, you may relate to that, or maybe you learned something totally different.
No, I did too. I learned exactly what you did insofar as the missions were concerned. There was no discussion that the Indians were actually slaves, or in some cases indentured servants, so to speak, right? I think that was the term, right? Wasn't that they were? Yes. Okay. Just making sure.
Yeah. They definitely.
But that was. Yeah. They were in no part, from what I understood, excited. Yay! Like, let's do this. Let's do hard labor and build these missions, and so that
for free,
so that we can become Christian. You know. Like, I don't think that was like the thing. But again, you're right. Like, I remember making my mission out of lima beans or whatever. And like, that was a thing. And I can appreciate that they are bringing the full picture into the discussion with your kids, because, you know, that's not something that we experienced. I just wish that the same thing was happening now. I think also to bring it back into the context of today, like when I hear that there are classrooms and teachers, you know, that are saying this is what the map of the Middle East looks like, and they're rearranging it based on what they personally want it to be versus what it actually is. And secondly, like erasing the Holocaust, that the Holocaust was a myth. Like those kind of discussions are very scary to me, in the same ways that we need to be having the discussions about what really happened to the Native Americans and what the Civil War actually was about. We need to be having the discussions of how this horrific experience happened and affected generations to come with trauma. You said something earlier that really resonated. We have this sort of privilege, this luxury of not having had the experience of living in a world where our rights are so oppressed. We've never really had, up until recently, a lot of our freedoms taken away. Certainly not the right to free speech. It's happening. It's already happened in other places in the world. And instead of glorifying it, I think we have to be very careful that we may have to, we have to come to terms with that so we don't become that. So I agree with you. We have to get loud about what we care about. I just think we have to find another presidential candidate. I don't know how the fuck we're going to do that. Anyway.
I've said for years that I wish that the Democrats in 2010 had been like, you know what? We need to look down the pike and like have our candidates. And like it is a real failure of the party. And like I am a Democrat, and I find that to be like a massive failure of the party that we did not do that. And really think about like, what is the candidate who's going to really represent this sort of that middle concept, right? Because there was so much opportunity to do that, and it didn't happen. And I am still like, it's 2024. I'm still angry about that not happening 14 years ago. But
you're not the only one.
Okay, good. But yeah, I think it is. There are a lot of shortcomings, and I wish that we weren't here in 2024 for so many reasons. But like on this topic, I wish that we were not here. Yes.
Yes. And I think it hits hard because of looking at, the older generations, right? And having that empathy for what they went through. And then also for our children. I loved, what was that? God, what was that song where everybody like held hands? It was like a whole thing. Not Give Peace a Chance. We Are the World. It's like, no. We need another like We Are the World comeback moment. If you could go back in time, is there anything that you would do all over again?
Yeah. So I love this question. Yeah, I would 100% leave law in the way that I did to create Dear White Women. A lot of people, we've had a lot of reaction to the name of the platform alone, right? Like, because you hear Dear White Women, no one is neutral on that. Okay. Everyone, you are either aggressively for it or you are super against it for a whole host of reasons. And, I think that Sarah and I took a big chance on doing this, but it was so important to us that we did it in that moment. And I would do that 100 times all over again.
If you could seed one message in everyone's mind across the planet, what would it be?
That's a good and pressure-filled question. That's a lot of people, but I think it's that we all matter, and because we all matter, it is really important that your voice is heard, right? And how your voice is heard is up to you, I think, because there's a lot of people who will tell you there's a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this. I don't really buy that, right? But we are in globally in the United States in sort of this odd fight for humanity. But I think we are in this sort of struggle, right? And it is a constant struggle, but it's been highlighted in recent years over who is considered part of humanity. And if we really believe that everyone is, then everyone's voice matters in this. Everyone has a role to play, and it does not have to be some big overarching role. You know what you feel is important. And I encourage you to use your voice for that. Because especially I feel like certain voices are very, very loud. But that doesn't mean your voice doesn't matter.
And that is how I think we can continue to grow and make a better place for our children. And that sounds cliche, but I love that. Your statement just chills. So
Yeah, I love it.
I'll take it a little bit lighter now. What is something that we wouldn't know about you? Like, what is something that we wouldn't know about you that we couldn't just Google and say, oh, that's something about Misasha's life? I know that's so creepy.
Okay, so something that people, actually only a few people know this about me, because it happened recently. But for many years, I did ballet, right? Until I had back surgery twice for scoliosis. So I only went back to ballet in my 40s, which is exactly when, people go back to ballet, obviously. But and it's been really interesting because in my 40s, I can see my 16-year-old self doing these things, like, and then I'm like, okay, body, like, do this. And it's like, oh no, we're not going to do that anymore. So it's like, okay. But and I never thought this would happen again. I got the chance to be in this ballet performance a couple weekends ago. And so I was the mother, which is, a role that I'm completely unfamiliar with. But it was so fun to be on stage again. And I was on stage and there's like 70 girls, and there's me and there's one adult male who's my husband, right? And this whole thing. It's so weird because I was walking backstage because I had to cross from stage right to stage left, sort of like behind the scenes. And I was walking and it was immediately like I was 16 years old again, like crossing behind the stage in a performance. Like it was like, 30 years went away. It's like, this is wild. But that was like one of those moments that, is just so special. And especially because I spend a lot of time in boys sports, right? Boys soccer, boys baseball. So there's a very different vibe there than 70 girls, 20 of which are high schoolers talking about, what is the best caffeinated drink from Starbucks? And, like, what's my 14-word Starbucks drink order, right? That is a completely different vibe. And I loved every minute of it. So I think that's something that people probably do not know about me.
And actually 3 that you are performing again. So is this a recurring theme that we're going to be seeing? Are you going to keep dancing on the stage? Will you be producing something soon? I feel like I can see like a Dear White Women iteration on stage.
Like lyrical dance style.
Yes.
Yeah, no. I do take ballet class. I try to take it twice a week during the school year, it's like my therapy, right? It's like, I have to turn off my brain from everything else because I have to focus so hard on the combinations or otherwise I'm not going to remember. And the great part about that class is that there are women who are 20 years older than me and there are women who are 10 years younger than me at times. And to be in a group of sort of these intergenerational women is like so fulfilling on so many levels. And we don't talk about what we do or what we did a lot. Some of them are retired, but we just dance. And, so I'm going to do that. I'm not sure about more stage performances. But yeah, I'll keep you posted if so.
Please do. And I love it because you just shared that you show up, and showing up is half of it, isn't it? I mean, yes, if you use your voice, definitely that's the double down. But I love that you just shared that you just show up as yourself and you dance and you move. Thank you for showing up and also using your voice with me today and for being here. It means so much. I love everything that you're doing. I'm so grateful that you spent time with me today to talk about so many different things. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, this was such an honor. Thank you for having me on your show.